Our third speaker is Shaina Anand, a filmmaker and artist who has been working independently in film and video since 2001 and since 2007 as CAMP, a Mumbai-based studio for transdisciplinary media practices, which she co-founded with Ashok Sukumaran. For me personally, CAMP has been an extremely important and provocative example of what is possible in a kind of co-organized model in terms of thinking with media technologies, archaeology of cinema, and various forms of distribution, really contesting legal structures and structures of intellectual property and all of that, but with valuable content that supports independent practitioners. So that's a very rare combination and way of working. Also, they have curated in many different kinds of platforms, and also in that sense troubled that term. So Shaina will be focusing on certain kinds of online annotated archival platforms, but then also the ways in which CAMP's work has been inserted into formats like biennials, festivals, and various institutions, very large-scale institutions, and also then like sort of your neighborhood institution, corner shop, rickshaw, etc. So that's the scale really at which CAMP is active, and that Shaina herself has really pursued the idea of raw material and fields of distribution. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Is this on? Yeah. Thank you, Natasha. You've raised the bar now. I will have performance anxiety. Thanks, Pratik, and thanks, Priyanka. It's great to be in this very familiar place for me, but now in this unfamiliar role. And I mean, I know Natasha said how maybe just out of need that in South Asia you find artists, you know, playing these shifting roles. Sometimes you're an archivist, sometimes you're a curator, sometimes you're a painter, sometimes you're a dancer, and you do these things by doing. You cannot be a painter till you paint. And so we've become curators by curating, and we've become archivists by archiving, and so on. CAMP currently has a small solo show in Brussels at Argos, the Center for Art and Media, and it's called Beginnings. And the curator there was looking back at works, sort of individual works by CAMP members between 2001 and 2008, what we call pre-CAMP and what he called proto-CAMP. But his idea was to kind of see a through line and see the technique and see the sort of ways of CAMP that then, you know, undergird and guide our practice or become the sort of fulcrum of our practice. So we were in that mode till a few weeks ago, and quite recently, almost in parallel, I was sent a text to proofread, which was written ages ago, and this was for Parul Dave and Rakhi Balaram's tome on Indian art. We're waiting and waiting and waiting for it. But in that, we actually went back to 2007. So these were the two things that kind of took me back in time. And we articulated, it's a sort of sidebar text to larger texts. We articulated what we thought was missing in their book, which was this particular milieu in 2007 in the city of Bombay that CAMP was born into. And of course, Bollywood, big industry, and you know, commercial art capital, but also commercial gallery scene. And it was around then in 2007 that this gallery, we had the dot-com boom. I lost a lot of my stoner cinema friends to that world or to Bollywood. But this particular gallery boom was quite interesting. For one, none of the CAMP members came from plastic arts, architecture, film, coding. But this was still our scene, right? And it was our scene to the extent of attending completely wild gallery openings and after parties. It was a certain time then. But also, falling into the radar of studio visits by a lot of international curators that were also dropping in to the shores of Bombay. So to that extent, yes, we were very much part of the art scene, but then not, right? We were never showing in those galleries. We were watching with amusement and sometimes even sheer horror how many artist friends of ours, peers whose works we liked, were suddenly increasing, per square inch and per floor area of these Bodhi-like startups that were coming up. Of course, there was a bust soon after that. But no matter how large these places got, our works wouldn't fit in, right? Mutually. They didn't want us, we didn't want them, but generally for its ephemerality, its unsaleability, and also our general grumpiness, okay? We were really grumpy. We drink the wine, but we'd stay very, very grumpy. So literally that's when we felt the need to, at that height of this gallery scene, to set up camp as a space where ideas and energies could become interests and forms and gather themselves. I'll read from here so that we keep time. This is camp. The image before that was also camp. Our own institutional imagination, we chose to say, was of a collectively run studio, a space for production, a unit of undetermined future function, which is more descriptive in a way, and in which windows were left open, soon to be entered, for other people to join in, and for things that may or may not be art. And even though we've redone our website, the About page is still from 2007. And we didn't feel like changing it, actually, because we can see now that some of our intentions or the words we used then were not only our guides, but gathered new meaning along the way. And this is 12 years hence now. They've become things beyond the words and sometimes beyond us. The studio has been from the beginning a space that could on short notice turn into a public space, not only for friends, but for the general and unknown public. This switching has happened more or less continuously over the last 2 years. The rooftop with its 4-meter wide screen, super projection, drinking's free or on cost, and no time limits, have nurtured over the years a kind of scene. We're not on social media, our grumpiness continues. So this outreach is through word of mouth, to more and more people coming in, being added to the mailing list, and of course now WhatsApp broadcast groups, which I've become slave to. But over the years, we've really enjoyed opening the studio out to workshops, to international gatherings, to times when people just live there, long duration workshops, short duration workshops, performances, an idea of releasing early. Like for us, there's always a formal stage of invention as we work, so we don't hold the final finite artwork that precious. So we have this habit of releasing early, putting the material also out there, putting the raw material out there, and kind of always creating this shared generosity, shared curiosity. We feel we're better off with that. It brings vulnerabilities, but it's something we've set up to do, right? It's very much a camp's ethos in that sense. So here's a very special New Year's countdown we did, which was called Rivers Without Banks. Extreme cinema. The shortest film was 8 hours long. But we did a reverse countdown from one of my most favorite films by the Filipino filmmaker Love Diaz, called Death in the Land of Encantos, which is 2007. And then we went to Wambing in the 90s, and Bellatar in the 80s, and we kept going back, Cloud Landsman, Peter Watkins, Kobayashi was the 50s. So we did this reverse countdown. People stayed the night. There was food, there was drink, there was special days for discussion because by then you're not going to discuss the film, and so on. I'm going to really jump cut to 3 things that camp really cares about, or we unpack in nuts and bolt ways. The studio, the idea of what a studio is, which I've touched upon to an extent, what is cinema, or what can be cinema, or what could have been of cinema, and infrastructure, right? And Ashok has this joke that says, I mean, he was reading Polyester Prince, which was Dhirubhai Ambani's biography. The Dhirubhai, when it came out, bought every book in sight and withdrew it, had it forcibly withdrawn from circulation. But then, of course, piracy Zindabad, the kids on the street were selling it. But he spoke about backward integration, right? If we're making polyester, we may as well, make the petroleum that makes it, and we may as well dig for the oil, and so on, right? So, in a way, it's nice to think like that. Of course, you need to have an ethos to imagine why you're doing this backward integration with your infrastructure. But quickly, I'm going to jump. These were 7 provocations. I'm going to do 1, 3, 5, the odd numbers. Devolve all roles that surround the image. Authors, subjects, technologies, content, use. Waste, my absolute favorite, don't wait for the archive. We've done Don't Wait for the Archive 2 in Beirut, 3 in Kabul, 2 good results. And lastly, deeds, not words. And with that, again, I come to sort of the 2007 moment. We've set up camp on the 11th of November 2007, but on 28th February 2008, we launch Public Access Digital Media Archive. And we can barely make rent. We don't have a studio. It's a 2-bedroom home. But in that, our colleagues from Berlin and colleagues from Bangalore, and 8 close friends, lawyers, activists, cinephiles, coders, but then the lawyer is the cinephile, and the coder is the artist, and the activist is the filmmaker. All this interdisciplinary mix-up happens, but we bring out into the public domain what we at that point considered the non-state archive of things that a community could put together and build together, right? Because by then, of course, the digital had entered the river of time sideways, much like the moving image had 100 years before that. And everyone could film, I mean, with certain entitlements in a certain class of people, could edit on a desktop. So the indie scene, in that sense, the independent documentary scene, especially in Bombay, was quite robust. What did you have? You had people making films because they were personally or politically motivated, and against all odds, budget crunch, struggling, wanting to somehow realize this work. And when it was finally realized, you had the big problem. Where are the screens, right? So there was distribution, the production was made possible, the distribution was still an issue. But we really thought one step further. We were like, the shooting ratios have changed. For every 60-minute film, you have 100 hours of footage. And you've struggled to make this cut, and you never want to look at the film, leave alone its footage again. So what happens to the 99 hours of footage, which is predictably under people's shoe boxes, and in a city like Bombay, just catching fungus as the days go by, or just there's water in your house, and there it's gone, So that's where Padma was born, to say let's care, let's collectively care for footage, let's bring it together, let you, me, people like us, which is the artist, the filmmaker, the creative practitioner, to some extent the cultural NGOs in the city, let's build these footage archives, let's care for it, let's interpret, let's layer over them. It's a very special interface that I won't have time to go into, but like I'll just quickly give you a sampling of. So here's Ishwar and Anushka, who travel and film a lot and make some very beautiful films. Here's footage from 2 of their projects. Or as we were doing housing histories, this film made in 1992 called Slum Bombay, and all its raw footage. There's Bal Thackeray saying he's going to promise 40 lakh homes to slum dwellers in Bombay, and that becomes the unique slum rehabilitation scheme in the city. But all the footage is there, it's transcribed, it's interpreted, sometimes scholars write over it. When we do have money and funding, there's rounds of fellowships, so people can really activate the archive and contribute texts to it, or reinterpret material, let it be set asunder from the authorial the attachment that the author had, and let somebody else traverse it and write across it and do these transversals across the archive, a lot of which has been happening. This is, for example, one kind of output. It's a treatment for a screenplay, for a documentary film, but where Sunil Kumar takes walks for 2 months, visiting 40 power plants in Chhattisgarh by foot. And so he's logging his footage, and it's not very different from how you make films, right? You do your research, you log the footage, you transcribe it, you index it, you keyword it, and then you make your film. So he actually does this process in situ inside Padma, because he films, he logs, he puts it up, and as that's happening, his treatment for his film becomes clear. He marks in and out, he makes his rough cuts in Padma, and he also makes his film, which then won the Vibgyor Film Award in Kerala. Or here's Srimoy doing her MPhil thesis inside Padma, where she's referring to the various videos that we have of the bar dancers in the archive, and writing across it. I don't know why it's not loading. I think I have too many tabs open. Or a journey through a dance archive. This is, sorry, because we're on 760, so the interface is also getting a bit crunched. But as Padma was struggling to stay afloat, it was 2013, which is the cinema, 100 years, India's cinema centenary. And grumpy people were sitting in the studio grumbling about like how stupidly this 100-year of cinema was being like marked by sort of the general amnesia and in the city. And so one winter we ripped Ashish Rajadaksh's Encyclopedia of Indian Cinema, put it in the Padma framework, which we also released as Pandora, which means it's a software and an instance and a dabba called Pandora that you can open and set up your own instance and archive. And so here's what Padma looks like inside. Here's the film. Here's transcripts. So in this case, Salim Langre Pe Matro has a running commentary by the director. It has annotations by scholars. It has other news clips, and all of this is tagged scene for scene. You can see the movie. There are various iterations in which you can see an annotated film or traverse the archive. One way would be to just, I don't know if we have internet. Yeah, we don't have net. Yeah, that's why some things haven't loaded, but it's online, so.
One can spend hours on your work. Gosh, this is fantastic.
So yeah, I mean, if you click, you can. So it's tagged. Here's the many films that are in the archive. The index is for 64,000 films. Only 24 were from Ashish's encyclopedia, but now we scrape other databases. Also, the 100 Years of Cinema created a quite comprehensive database of Marathi cinema, Telugu cinema, Malayali cinema, and so on. So this database keeps going on, but the movies with videos are 8,500. We still have much more than the National Film Archive of India. India has the, no, it's true, it's true. India has, it's a 4% survival of cinema before the 30s, and it's apparently amongst the lowest in the world, as you know. So here's an essay format. It's also, as Natasha was saying, threshing these thresholds, right? Like ethics that begins where law ends, testing intellectual property, or we like to say what governs us is the idea of intellectual propriety and not property, right? Like all archivists are pirate, all filmmakers are pirate, and we shouldn't have problems with that, right? I mean, we have to be part of a continuum of culture. It's always continuous. Ethics has to govern and not law or copyright or property. So here's Majumdar, for example, testing what Madison Press can do, because she puts her whole book, or in this case, she was testing with chapter 5, which is Gangland, Bombay, and she's citing, she's doing the annotations across the films, and as you play it, you can read annotations, and they pass by with time code. But it's chapter 5, Gangland, Mumbai, where she's looking at 3 films, Parinda, Satya, and Company, that's made a certain time frame in Bombay. And as she writes, she also realizes how the idea of now writing alongside film has to change how we write. We no longer have to say, in the soundtrack is dripping water and the rustle of leaves, because this is now being heard. So it new forms of writing. So she's begun working. She's done Panch by Anurag Kashyap inside the archive, where now that she had the film, otherwise she was writing about how it's been censored and withdrawn and never been released, and it's a different kind of writing. But when you write across film, it changes, and so on. I can't stream, but I don't know if anything is playing. I don't have internet, it seems.
प्रभा, मिस्टर जगत नारायण के आने तक अपने गाने की ही मशक कर लो. अच्छी बात है.
अखियाँ जपी मोरी, अखियाँ जपी मोरी, बिसरा गई सोधा.
Let's see if we. So here are, I'm going to really race through. Here's other things that we like to think about, and this extends to a lot of the work we do. Privilege escalation comes from a hacker term, which is when you don't have permission to get somewhere, you escalate, right? You hack it, you get admin access. And I often tell curators who we work with and work with quite closely that you guys have the keys. Now, you know, let's do this kind of privilege escalation. We're artists, we have privilege, one of which is we're contemporary artists, we can do just about anything. So how do we escalate these privileges in a way that they also redistribute interestingly? And we've developed confidence to be able to do these things, but it's not always rosy, right? This was Sharjah Biennial, and after showing concurrently in 3 Sharjah Biennials and the March meetings in between, we, or part of us, was uninvited to the UAE, right? Banned. Yeah. And this comes from a certain engagement where that generosity, that openness, the open sourceness, the feedback, the idea of collectives, all of which the art world, the institutional art world seems to like, suddenly hits a wall and becomes hostile. This was a book we had done during the Sharjah Biennial in 2009, and the only way this was possible is because of a certain kind of royal patronage that the biennial has, right? We managed to access the customs records for this particular dhow trade of ships made in an estuarial town in the Gulf of Kutch in Gujarat, almost 100% Muslim seafaring society, moving where nobody else went at that point, in the direction of piracy and sanctions, bringing trade at that point to the various semi-states in Somalia. And parallel to that project, we actually had a radio broadcast. And I remember Sheila getting really worried, Sheila Gowda, that her shipment won't arrive in time. And someone told her, relax. It's addressed to the Sheikha. Everything arrives in time. And so we were like, let's order an FM transmitter. And then we're sitting next to the director with his credit card. And he's like, which one? I'm like, 13 watts, which means you could be heard really far and wide. So again, scheduled as opening week performances, but it's actually FM radio broadcast that this is safe distance for biennial goers on the roof of the old museum, but closer to the port. There was a lot of action. There was a lot of exchange of music. There was actually video, which then became the start of a 5-year collaboration with the sailors. But it's at this time that we are invited by a British curator. Our son was 2 days old when this invitation came, and I think he was 9 days old when the invitation was taken away. She was asked, this British curator was asked by a Gujarat-based organization to curate an exhibition called Gujarat and the Sea, the Theatre of the World. And someone had given her a PDF of our Wharfage book, and she was very keen that it takes some form, whether printed or as a book or certain pages, and apologized for a somewhat late invitation, but was very keen it be included, despite us having a baby and stuff. We agree. And 9 days later, we're uninvited, because the patrons who were Darshak Itihas Nidhi, Gujarat Gas, British Gas as sponsors, felt that it was too contemporary. And along with the exhibition was a conference called Gujarat and the Sea, a history and anthropology conference taking place at that venue, where you literally had to shut the windows to keep out the sound of shipbuilding or boat building happening right outside. But this entire shipbuilding made by Muslim seafarers, built, owned, and operated, was being occluded while they were talking about how the boats were stitched and how the Gujaratis went as far as Africa and all of this. The fact that they were still going and being the ship of everything, medicines, as the book showed us. Medicine Sans Frontiers is not going, World Food Programme is not going to Somalia, but these boats were going every single day. So you're uninvited. Ashok lands up at the exhibition, and there he is with the Nikon Coolpix, clicking a photograph on the wall of, this is Alan Villiers. We like two Alans, Sekula and Villiers. We really like both of them, and they footnote a lot of our practice. But taking a photograph, and then we recreate this exhibition or a selection of it called the Annotated Gujarat and the Sea. So these, when the British curator called it opportunistic, she meant she managed to wrangle digital rights to a lot of these historical maps and images in the British Library and the National Maritime Museum and places in the UK for a limited release of digital prints for a 3-month run of a traveling exhibition. But here we are photographing it and repurposing it. That's their catalog, and the thumbnails are the ones we work on. They get stuck as a key guide. This is an old Gulf of Cambay map overlaid with their own sponsors' brochure of British Gas and Gujarat Gas pipelines running over the same area. It takes on this exhibition. There it is in the National Gallery of Modern Art, and here it is in the Bhaudaji Lad Museum. Some quick details. Colonial aquatints and watercolors overlaid with cell phone images of ships in those very regions burning. Okay. Yeah. So I was going to come to the third part of my presentation, and I don't know how much time we have, but I'll be quick. It's sort of now moving into the mainstream. For 3 years, a formal bit of curation, pretty much an extension of Camp Rooftop, but something called the new medium. And its premise was mostly that art historically, the moving image in cinema is just 125 years old, right? And so it's inherently a new medium comparing it to the durée and history of, say, painting or sculpture. So for 3 years, this curation has taken on very specific historical trawls into this inherent new medium to look at sort of formal inventions that have happened. So that was year one. Year two was called footage films. No, these films are not there because these are not. But can I take 5 minutes to go through this? So this was the second year. The first year, I mean, I wanted to go through some of why this line, starting with Vertov, which was performed with live music by a quartet in Ukraine, because a lot of Man with the Movie Camera is in Ukraine, and why this arc with Space is the Place and Pere Portobello, Liz Rhodes' light music was shown with fog inside the cinema hall, and why we wanted to take over the cinema halls themselves. This was the next thing, again, very close to us. We've screened footage and films as two separate things and combined them on the roof. But here the idea really was to give a new genre, because otherwise we say objet trouvé or found footage. And this was footage films, because none of these people found the footage on a walk in the park, right? Or in their grandfather's trunk, or in a dustbin. There was very precise method and reason to make these assemblages a certain way. So of course we began with two concurrent things happening in the North and South, the Third Cinema Movement and Hour of the Furnace and Society of the Spectacle in the North. Went on to Mikkel Kleer's film is the first CCTV film made in '83. He's a senior of Farokhi. And along with these, we had...
in 1891, a balloon carrying a Lieutenant Mansfield, who belonged to the Royal Navy, developed
a
leak
live
while at about
event
1,000
inside
feet
a cinema hall in the IMAX theater,
and
where we
fell.
told a 200-year-old history of the neighborhood, which is Parel, central Mumbai. And we were telling it from the rooftop of Phoenix Mills,
And let's call
which
this
is now Phoenix Malls, and you're in
moment
Hall
our
7
descent
IMAX Theatre PVR,
into
the
Lower
largest
Parel.
mall in Bombay. But we managed to tell you a 200-year-old history, camera obscura style, where you're sitting in this big room and being engulfed on the IMAX screen by an image,
Parachute
CCTV
opened
image of the
partially,
immediate outside,
but didn't stop
which
him
is
from
seeing 8 kilometers out and all around and into buildings, and take this
Strange
narrative
sparks
arc
appeared.
that really began with the first aerial view of the city and took you over 200 years.
He remembered his corpse.
We also brought Media Storm together, which is India's first film collective. Not just all-woman collective, it really was the first film
Media Sabina and
collective.
Charu.
And here's Shoini speaking. Maybe we don't have time to play it, but this is their last film, Kiska Dharm, Kiska Desh, where they actually filmed in Whose Country Is It Anyway, was the English translation, but Whose Religion, Whose Country is the literal translation, where they filmed the Rath Yatra. Being women, nobody found them problematic. They filmed inside, they filmed the Shilanyas. They're the only ones who filmed in the Sita Garbh Griha, inside the temple and so on. And these films were lost. It took 5 years of me badgering all 6 of them to say, find the films. And Sabina Kidwai found one, and then Shoini Ghosh found one, and the last one was found. And so nobody had seen these films for 20 years. And so we digitized them. We did an assemblage of, through cut, through the 3 films, and 4 out of the 6 joined us. And I mean, they're all academics, they're all pedagogues, so they very nervously wrote this really perfect script where each one handed over the baton, and they traced the sort of media history, the media archaeology. They spoke about technology when they were working, and sort of the political arcs, and an incredibly layered presentation. The other one we did was, again, I can't play, I have lots of video to play, but Kamal Swaroop's 40-year-long project on tracing Phalke, which has taken on so many iterations, including a multimodal workshop that he has done across 9 cities wherever Phalke spent his life and time, working with students there. An incredible scrapbook. So we actually unpacked his IFA proposal and made these videos, and also read from the screenplay. All of this is online. I will be very quick and come to the third, which is exciting because I don't think it's been done before. It was 2 full days of programming of multi-screen works, contemporary video installations were put inside the cinema hall. And this, of course, comes from us being artists and not being able to see a single full work in any of the group shows and biennials and exhibitions we're part of, never being happy with the settings, because the sound is bouncing off, the seating is thing, there's light spill because you're sharing the space with someone. And where is that darkness, that engulfing feeling, that anonymity that modernity and cinema gave you? Sit next to someone you don't know or partake in this phenomenal shared experience. So that was really the impulse behind bringing in the need for understanding what multi-screen can look like, the need to be able to see them together so you can understand why you like certain ones and why some don't work, or what potential does this grammar have. And so we brought in 15 films, and you could see them in the course of a whole day. Don't ask how we would change the room from 3 channels to 2. You can ask us how in camp we cracked this, and we can plug multi-channels and do what we want with them with relative ease now. What some tech guy charges some artist or biennial the earth to do, we do every day now. That was Agnes Varda, who began this is Money Calls E.T., this is Naeem's film, and you see how it goes. We can move into Q&A. I will just play this in mute at the back. So you just see what it felt like. She wanted pink light. Should we sit there?
One of the theses on the archive is the past of the exhibition threatens the future of the archive. Could you elaborate a bit about that?
How many vitrines have you seen with documents and documents and documents and documents?
Also in connection to annotated history of Gujarat and the sea, in a way, because this seems that it can connect like that.
No, absolutely. I mean, it begins with just spiral ramp being some new way you can experience art, right? And the fact that things have been made so precious that there are already like closures, right? Like where Naomi was talking about basements and posters and all of this, like the one way to capture it is to put it back in a fortress, right? And say, this is valuable art history, it's the missing history, it needs to be written, but then there it goes, right? So that's also where that's coming from, because for us there has to be relay, and there has to be, you know, okay, the vitrine may not let you touch the document, but you may not touch a document ever again, but there are other ways to feel them, and that's really where that's coming from.
And just could you talk a little bit more also about the other kind of where things are at now with your other sort of key collaborators, like just because it might not be so clear to everybody, like for instance, the 0 into 260 lab in Berlin and the kind of programming that they're doing and how they're kind of changing from Pandora to just other sorts of ways to use the
what lab?
like
Sorry?
using your Berlin
Yeah.
collaborators, for instance, as
Yeah.
well, Jan and so like the way that they have carried forward the collaboration with y'all for so many years, but also what say their role is to actually disseminate the practice and the platform for other practitioners. And also say like very much like close to Calcutta, the fact that the Media Lab in Jadavpur University has been a collaborator for you as well. Sarai, I mean some of these institutions have in the meantime, they don't exist in the same way or they don't operate in the same way. And it would just be nice to sort of do a quick time capsule in that sense of these very key collaborations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of hard work to keep things going, but hey, you've got an archive now, and you have to, you know. We've not had funding for 2 years. We've had our FCRA stalled for a year. That's also prevented us from keeping things going. In Berlin, in that sense, seem a little more precarious than us as well. More so because once we had this Pandora instance, the sort of shared platform, Padma finished 10 years last year, and we had a similar gathering on the roof and in venues across the city, but a 3-week residency called Forward Re-Archive. So back and forward and back again. And we invited all the collaborators over the last 10 years. So we worked with Mariam Ghani in the Documenter 12 thing in Kabul, but we digitized 100 reels of Afghan cinema and immediately put it in the public domain with annotations by the staff and the negative cutter, the cameraman and the director. There's 858.ma, which is the archive of the Egyptian Thawra and revolution. There's Buck.ma, which is Video Occupy and Occupy Gezi and Taksim Square. Buck means, so they all take on .mas, but 858 is just 858 hours. They didn't want to give it a name of like Archive of the Revolution. Buck.ma means don't look. And it has the resistance movement of the Video Occupy Collective and then this other stuff. There's Turkish Cine.ma. The instance is being used a lot more also as a closed platform. It's not necessarily online, and I think over the years we have also changed our own militant stand of saying it has to be in the public. I mean, the reason why Padma seems that it's not grown is that a lot of the things are now marked restricted or private, right? There's 250 hours of the Shared Footage Collective in Gujarat, filmed in 2002 after the pogrom. It's there, people access it when they need to, but we're very happy that nobody even accesses it now. There will be a time and a place when that kind of material comes online. Since we run it, and we also have to care for the server in Berlin, the actual mirror in the studio, and a mirror in Bangalore, it is a lot of daily pressure, but I think Xenia, who works on it, is just, I mean, never is a drive lost because it's well backed up. And these are really still, even though we were funded for quite many years, these are not RAID drives and stuff. This is a network of just WD 4 terabyte bytes in a cupboard in camp that's called our server room. So that's really how we build these things. Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about the sort of recent work that you're doing in Bombay with Prasad and Rupali, and what sort of collectivity you're interested in now? Because you've sort of gone through so many models, and the sort of space you're creating to think about questions that have to do with housing from within this city that you know so well, with a lot of disappointments that it holds as well, but then kind of still trying to find where the capacities for its own reinvention lie, perhaps.
I mean, Bombay has to wait for this real estate collapse, really, and it might really change the city, because there's I was reading an article recently of phantom buildings, right? They've been bought over by speculators in Dubai and even China, and of course a lot of diaspora, and they're just lying empty, they're lying unfinished, all these HDI. I mean, look at the massive housing scams we've heard about this very month, right? So I feel that collapse, while it'll hit the city really badly, might recover in a certain way. But with Prasad and Rupali, we, for the last 3 years, run a space called R&R, and it's set in an R&R colony, resettlement and rehab. You wouldn't call it a colony, but massive block of 70 buildings, each with 150 flats that are 225 square feet large, which was apparently the part of the largest displacement and resettling urban program in the world, when the MUTP in Bombay, Urban Transport Project, displaced 50,000 families and put them into these vertical slums. So that's where R&R, which for us is read and research, rock and roll, reinvent and relax, and we like all these backronyms, is. And of course, that's also enabled the housing history. There's a never-ending in-house, I mean, without a finite end, in-house project at camp called Past, Present, Future. 3 years ago, we were joined by Simpreet Singh, who is not an artist. He was doing his PhD at TIS, but before that, in urban studies, habitat studies, but before that, he was someone who started the most interesting and important housing rights movement in our time in 2004, called the Ghar Bachao, Ghar Banao Andolan. So because he always had this dream of having a public museum of people's history or some publication, and that's when our conversations began. It actually began with him having a Padma Fellowship to be able to dig these materials and, annotate from the archive, because it already had a lot of Bombay in it, including Ghar Bachao, Ghar Banao's own archive. But there began these histories into, these journeys into minor histories in the city. We had this confidence of, hey, what about that? And there it was in Indian cinema. There it was in Padma, right? So these things were easy. And where they weren't there, and we went deep in search of them, say into the Asiatic or the Maharashtra State Archive, or to various traces, right? The one person who's still alive after the police mutiny and has moved outside of Bombay, and you go and interview them or pick up some documents. All of this, that release early is still something we like to do. We put them back in the archive. And so the housing histories was first done as short assemblages on the roof. Like we had a little story and we'd do an event, and then we had these quite finite episode 1, 2, 3, and we'd perform them. And then we had all of C, the School of Environment and Architecture, their 4th and 5th year, spent 3 long evenings at camp where we presented the Housing History Trilogy, which is 70 years of housing in Bombay. And then we did it at KRVIA. And then we went in search of more material, right? So it's completely iterative and generative. But recently, for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, we also had money, because there was a commission. It's now being published. So it takes from the lecture performance, and it takes from the fact that, in fact, I can share you the link. Please trade it for a Netflix film at night and watch it. But it draws live from Padma and Indian cinema, and it has a certain interface, which is sort of a simplified tunnel vision, dense dive you can do within the archive platforms. But here, when you just press the pause button, you get these overlays, right? So imagine reading a book, but the footnote was not just citation 1, page 69 of so-and-so's book, but could open up the book. So in this case, if it's film clip, it takes you to an annotated part, and you can go further. If it's a document or a photograph or a book, you could go further, and then they also form these branching paths. So it's quite epic for us also to put it out there to the world, because even as we perform it, it's tiring. It's 70 years. It's a lot. It's extremely dense, but it's a lot of fun because of the sort of surprises that happen. but the only feedback we've got from one is from academics, right, who want to collaborate with us, right? Because and PhDs that want to be written on the thing, right? So that's immediately that's what's been happening, right? Like, can we do a book together? From other historians or urban researchers. But yeah.
Are there any questions from the audience? Very quiet today.
Thank you, Shayna. It's a very quick question. In places of political poverty that I think a lot of us are embodying in various ways with the work that we do, especially when we're collecting experiences and we're working across continents, to what extent do you get concerned about the custodianship of all of these people's memories? I mean, the archive of Padma is incredible, and it's transatlantic, it's accessible globally if you ask for it, but ultimately it's engineered by you. So do you have a conception of what happens post you?
But it's not entirely engineered by us, right? The contributor who's putting that footage in is the sort of primary source of the material. And like we said, like it's an ethical decision, right? Like, they made a film, they had certain equations with their subjects, and it's just moving one step to say, and at any given time, it's at the onus of the contributor to say, well, I'm putting this, but I'm not putting this, right? It's not a wash your. In fact, filmmakers will not want to wash that dirty laundry there, because it also reveals their vulnerabilities as well, right? We know how we access and do certain interviews and pull out things. So to that large extent, the Padma is entirely contributor-based, right? So this footage is coming from the person who has it, and will always contain contestation, right? Like when we work collaboratively with subjects, we have a certain way of working, but you could also turn around and say, yes, but then you've made this film in Palestine with 8 families using the camera, but now you're being acquired. So I don't think that we have to think of things in such limits. There are larger ethics that I think one should be
Yeah, I guess I was more thinking
about.
Technically. There's a lot of data being stored, and that's CAMP maintaining that data.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more a question of the technical side post you. Do you have a vision of who else will carry that forward?
No, but, and this is a very technical answer I'm giving you, in keeping things open source, from the kernel to the core, from the software to the codec that's on, there's nothing proprietary, which also means when there's obsolescence, the codec is open, the platform is open, all that data, say you take an annotated film, everything in it is in XML, right? So it's all contained in extremely open formats, which means hopefully, yeah. And I mean that was thought through in terms of how many websites don't work because you don't pay for Flash or things like that. I mean, it's come from the open source movement, right? Jan and Sebastian, who are the sort of genius behind the platform, it's not coming out of thin air that they want to use, or Mozilla Foundation is funding it or something. No, it's the ethos, right? It's everything they do.
Yeah, I just remember also a quote coming from Shubigi's first book, where, sorry, Shubigi, I'm bringing you in, but there was this very revealing moment where she talks about how there's certain archives sitting on Google that only last for a certain number of years. And we as citizens don't quite understand that that's going to vanish very quickly. And to what end do we as users care? And I think your Padma is a very good moment to ask ourselves when we're accessing it, to what extent do we as individual users care? I'm always interested in putting it back on the user.
Yeah, I mean, and we care enough to not have ever been on Facebook, or so this the general grumpiness of spending time, making sure that XML stays open and those codecs stay open and all. I mean, I don't think it's a sacrifice to not be on those platforms, but it really, it comes from understanding political economy and capture of things
I'm just curious,
and so on.
because it's open source, what do you do for censorship? I mean, lots of people must be posting incendiary stuff, but how do you prevent that? How do you prevent
So it's not as easy as like this, no? So it's an interface that if you really want to engage with, you have to engage, right? So it's like when you go into a library, you can pick the first book, you can read it, so you can do that, press play, browse, see what's featured on the homepage, which is not updated.
outside is allowed to annotate over there, so how do you?
Yes, but to annotate takes effort, right? So if there was someone who was really interested in just a right-wing troll, so to speak, it takes an effort to go in to do that, and that's also how marginal we are, right? Like right-wing trolls aren't, you know, so that's what this point of being uninvited to Gujarat or to be banned from Abu Dhabi are real effects, right? And we've been very careful of those real effects in Padma in terms of where we feel, and we've been also careful on our roof. Like often we know, like there's some IB guy who's shown up to the screening, right? But you keep your certain safeguards, and I think us not being in the public domain in that sense is
No, just one question that over these years, like I think it's 10 years now, so what have the uses of the archive been? Have things come back to you that people have used the archive and made some stuff, or what's generally just a question about how it's been used?
So with Padma, a lot harder. Like we've entertained a lot of footage requests, and we kind of there's what's low res we don't track back at all. But if people want the high res, it just takes an email connecting back to source and putting them in touch. But then we've got the high res backed up in the case of Padma, right? Because it's contributor driven. Whereas Indian cinema is it's completely pirate. You don't own any of that in your. So we've managed to have that loop. The more support we've found ourselves giving is less in Padma for use case, but for help in putting the material in, right? Like now there's a feminist archive that wants to happen as across six NGOs and a lot of women's rights movements. Northeast is doing their own archive. They've got funding from the Sakagawa Peace Foundation. So it's also about, in an earlier avatar, we said, put it all in Padma. But you see why these things have to have their own sort of way. With Indian cinema, because it's a finite, see, Padma is also kinky, it's fragile, right? It's got all sorts of things, and you have to dig, and you pull out some gem, and you pull out a lot of detritus also, and you have to, it's big, it's a lot of material, but it takes a whole different way of engaging with it, that it comes from everyday life practice and understanding document, you're writing critically about it. But with Indian cinema, because it's finite cinema objects, it's being used quite extensively by all the film studies departments. You mentioned JU Media Lab as well. JU Media Lab, is anyone here from there? For years, we would go and take a photograph of the golden plaque, okay? There was a bronze plaque saying JU Media Lab, and there was never any internet. So we'd carry our dongles from Bombay and come here. So this is just, this is also how, when we say don't wait for the archive, they had funding, and they want to do these film archives, but Chitrabani and all is scanned and kept, but after, there's this institutional, like dead weight that surrounds a lot of these places and these proprietary formats. We did this whole project on law and cinema, and we used DSpace. We did this other project, and we used Quora, and then you use some other, content management system, and then you use something else. So, yeah. So no, to finish that question, the film studies people are using it a lot, and also annotating and contributing back. But Padma, it's still, it takes a long time to process material and then put it up. So people are using it, but we've not seen, apart from us now doing this housing histories in this way.
Yeah, you're saying about not to wait for the archive. I think people who are practicing in the field, who do research, there's always a lot of footage which we really don't know at times how to handle because, as you said, 99 hours of footage which goes into one short film. So what would be your suggestions to practitioners of keeping their archives intact or how to utilize it? Is there any, with your, I think this was a wonderful presentation that you gave us, and I think if you could just give some suggestions about that.
I mean, so when we set up Padma, it sounded all like really, I mean, the way Bombay filmmaking community discussed, oh God, what is all this open access? This sounds so sarai, this is that. Like, we were really, you know, and right wing will misuse and right wing will misuse. And I'm like, right wing doesn't need you. They really don't, you know, let's create another space. But to go back to, we were like, what are we saying that's wrong here? You shoot, you put a date, you put a time, you put a location, you have labels, you put indexes, you put keywords, and you have time code logs. And then if it's in a language you don't understand or you need to subtitle, you have full transcript. This is exactly what's happening here. This is a logging indexing system, which has been done for the good part, unless you're a disorganized filmmaker like me. Those 99 hours are very nicely logged, keyworded, indexed. So it's really about keeping that, caring for it, and when people bring it to a place like Padma, maybe it's a little more anal because we want to make sure all of it is not incomplete, so we spend some time doing that. Also have an info page, have those safeguards of provenance and contributor and things like that. And then we back it up. That's the use. Do you have it? My hard drive crashed. Yes, we have all of it. Come and take it. So yeah, just annotate and keep it alive. Because intentions of the finite film always expire, and in the footage there's, so all this residue and all remnant doesn't work, right? In it is a reserve. It's a.
And the process becomes more important parallelly.
Thank you, Shaina.
Thank you.
We need to close. It's hard to wrap up today. So, because it really feels like we started also thinking about, through Naomi, I mean, looking at the need for art historical analysis, but as a practice, as a way to disrupt the kind of temporalities and that institutional histories want to consider in their hierarchy of management, of knowledge, and kind of going from that to camp and China just feels like we kind of had this very steep slope that we kind of really very fluidly crossed through. So in a way it felt
into the ordinary.
Yeah. And it felt that really we need these different strategies and we need each other in that sense across different kinds of again, just different styles also, like to just, that's the thing when we talk about methodology as the anchoring point for the hub, there are always these strange, intuitive synergies that build through the 3 days. And we never know. We sort of try and pair people together, but these kind of correspondences are really where the dialogue grows, and hopefully it will grow more and more intense. And again, we don't have to agree with each other at any point. Every individual's standpoint is a marking in these days. So yeah, thank you all. Unfortunately, Nora couldn't be with us, but we might ask her also to revisit her her lecture maybe as something that's recorded, so that you all can also view it later and access it online through the Experimenter website as well. And I do think that some of the positions that she brought through with artists that are, again, looking at archaeology in ways that are challenging nationalistic frameworks of reading antiquity, and again of property in relation to who owns a certain kind of icon, or who owns a certain site. I mean, we know what's happening here. So to reread and re-narrate from archaeology through Nora's Phantom Limb exhibition, really, I could tell you from having seen it that it really was something that felt quite timely. So yeah, thank you so much.
And maybe she could have answered Lydia's question better, because I was interested in it as well.
Yeah.
But just for Nora, maybe.
Is she online?
Maybe she's following us. Just for Nora, I think because she couldn't make it, it would be wonderful to possibly hear from all of you if you have any questions from what you saw, because she will join us on the last day. And because Skype doesn't work well in the UAE, we might call her on the phone. So if you have questions, do leave it with us, email us, or write it down, and we'll reach back. On that note, thank you so much for sitting through the day. I know it takes a lot out of each one of you to be able to participate in this wholehearted manner. Thank you for that, and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow fresh in the morning. We will start on time, as you saw. We will stick to time through the day. So we're supposed to be here by 10:30 latest. Do come and take your seats. For those of you who are interested, Samsung Yang is performing right now at the Experimenter Baliganj space with Vachagan Tadeuszwan, who is his Armenian musician collaborator for his piece Available Forms, which is also the title work of the show. The gallery is open now, and the performance is about 30-35 minutes. It starts about now, in about 15 minutes.
Priyanka?
Yes. One performance. We had one yesterday evening.
Offsite space, what are ours, in case we can go before or after?
There is also another offsite space, Experiment Outpost, which is open very long, like 10 p.m., because the security guard doesn't close it. But it's open all the time on Sunday, Saturday, whatever, Monday to Sunday.
So we can go after.
Good night and see you tomorrow.